Good evening. My name is Navjit Casey. I'm a student project manager here at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues. On behalf of the Clarke Forum and the National Security Network, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Keeping America Safe and Safeguarding American Values. Since the declaration of the War on Terror, numerous reports of torture have surfaced regarding the treatment of suspected terrorist detainees. The Abu Ghraib abuse scandal and questions over treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base show that in times of war, concerns can be raised about the right to be free from torture and abuse. Speaking tonight will be Rear Admiral John Hutson and Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Couch. They will address the question of how the United States can fight terrorists and strengthen its security in ways that are strong and consistent with international law and American values. Rear Admiral John Hutson is currently the Dean and President of Franklin Pierce Law Center in Concord, New Hampshire. In May 1997, he was appointed the Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy. In his 28 years of experience with the Navy, he has been awarded numerous distinctions, including the Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Navy Commendation Medal, and the Navy Achievement Medal. Also speaking is Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Couch, a former prosecutor in the Office of Military Commissions. The office is responsible for prosecuting alleged war criminals held at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. He was featured in the Wall Street Journal for his decision not to prosecute a Guantanamo detainee because of his concerns that the man might have been abused. As a result, Lieutenant Colonel Couch is the recipient of the American Bar Association's 2007 Norm Millang Minister of Justice Award. At this time, I would like to ask that you turn off all cell phones and electronic devices. Also, please hold all questions until the question and answer session at the end of the program. Because this event is being taped and some audience members may be hearing impaired, please wait until the microphone has been brought to you before beginning to speak. I would also like to remind you that immediately following our program this evening, there will be a continuing the conversation session in Stern 102. This will be an informal session led by students. Now, please join me in welcoming Rear Admiral John Hutson and Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Couch.
Thank you all. Special thanks to the organizers of the Clarke Forum and to Ryan, who's been very much involved with us from the beginning. So I am honored to be here. I don't know how many of you do sort of public speaking, but I'm always really comfortable and at ease until I realize that there are people in the audience who know more about my subject matter than I do. And that always puts me a little bit on edge. So if I seem a little bit on edge, please bear with me, because we have a number of Army officers here. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about, they know more about than I do. I am proud to be a staff officer. I've never shot a bullet in anger. I never dodged a bullet. And that lack of perspective is something that I'm sensitive to. So that I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that I think I know something about, but we'll get to Q's and A's. And if I don't know anything about you, you guys let me know. I want to talk about a lot of things, but it all kind of revolves around America and what America is and what it has been and what it will be, I think. Because I think that putting that in a context is really important. Thomas Paine said in 1776 in common sense that the cause of America is, for the most part, the cause of all mankind. The cause of America is, for the most part, the cause of all mankind. And then, many years later, in 2007, that great geopolitical analyst and observer, Bono, said that America is more than just a country, it's an idea. America is more than just a country, it's an idea. And I think that's true. I just got back, in the last few months, I've been to Ireland, Germany, and Norway on doing things like this. And I am, in each of those places, I am continually impressed with how important America is to them. How much they care about this election, how much they know about this election. Unless you've been there, and particularly unless you've been there recently, there meaning almost any other place, because I feel the same way when I go to Asia, you really don't understand how important America is. America has, for centuries now, and certainly since World War II, provided leadership to the rest of the world. It wasn't always appreciated. It sometimes wasn't even liked. And sometimes it was very much disliked. But that's a role that we have taken upon ourselves, and for the most part, I think it's been good. It's been good for us, and it's been good for the world and the rest of the world. And I think that that's a responsibility that we need to bear in mind even now. And I'm not sure that we always have. There's a saying that may you live in interesting times, and I think that we do now live in interesting times, and unfortunately that saying is kind of a curse, that you live in interesting times. George Washington, during that war, prohibited the Revolutionary soldiers from mistreating Hessian mercenaries who had killed, basically in cold blood, American captives. And that was sort of the first example of America the way we think of it now in dealing with detainees. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, as a result of Andersonville and the horrors of the Andersonville prison, commissioned a fellow by the name of Dr. Francis Lieber to create what became known as the Lieber Code, dealing with how to deal with prisoners. The Lieber Code morphed into the Hague Conventions, which became the Geneva Conventions. And remember that the Geneva Conventions, from the U.S. point of view, were largely enacted to protect U.S. troops. The U.S. wanted the Geneva Conventions to improve on the Hague Conventions after World War I. And after World War II, wanted the Geneva Conventions because it was U.S. troops, it was these guys who were at the pointy end of the spear, who were more forward deployed than all other countries combined in any way you count forward deployment. Numbers of deployments, numbers of troops, locations, duration, however you identify forward deployment, it's U.S. troops who are there, more than everybody else combined. And the Geneva Conventions were there primarily, from our point of view, to protect us. It wasn't to protect the enemy from us, it was to protect us from the enemy. So I think it's important with that as a backdrop. Now I'm going to start to sound awfully political, forgive me, but we are where we are. Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, I can't help that. We can call him something else. Call him Joe Bag of Donuts. Joe Bag of Donuts says they're all terrorists, so different rules apply, without ever identifying what those rules are. He just said different rules apply. meaning basically the Geneva Conventions don't apply. Many of you have read the memo that Admiral Gonzalez wrote explaining why the Geneva Convention should not apply. And basically he says, I remember reading this. I've been in my office. In fact, I've still got it in my briefcase. And I've got "wow" with question marks or exclamation points after it. I couldn't believe he said it, and I sure as hell couldn't believe they put it in writing. But he said, and you can read it, it's part of history, the Geneva Convention should not apply because, they're quaint and outdated, but the real reason for it was, and they are to some extent, we pay prisoners of war in Swiss francs. I mean, they are quaint and outdated in some respects. But the real reason he didn't want them to apply was because, and this gets a little complicated, so bear with me. If the Geneva Conventions apply, that brings in the War Powers Act. And grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions are a war crime under the War Powers Act, domestic legislation. You can't be prosecuted. You following this? You can't be prosecuted for violating the Geneva Conventions. You can be prosecuted, like life, for violating the War Powers Act, which, oh, by the way, we enacted to protect our troops again. But Admiral Gonzalez is telling the President of the United States as Commander-in-Chief, because grave breaches of the War Powers Act, grave breaches of Geneva, I got myself confused, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions are a violation of the War Powers Act, or war crime. We don't want the Geneva Conventions to apply. And that, my friends, was the beginning of the end. Because then we said, well, we're not going to do competent tribunals, term of art in the Geneva Convention. Competent tribunals are there kind of to separate the men from the boys. And they're not really defined in the conventions. But we did them in the first Gulf War. We did hundreds and hundreds of them. And about 80% of the people that went to these so-called competent tribunals, and in so-called, pejorative sense, called competent tribunals, were released as refugees. They were not detained. So when we said the Geneva Conventions don't apply, we didn't do competent tribunals. Now we got all these guys, we got to figure out something to do with them. This will sound like shameless name dropping, but forgive me. I was being interviewed by Peter Jennings about competent tribunals. And I said to him, this is before Abu Ghraib, and I said to him, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that there's any abuse going on. All I'm saying is that the Geneva Conventions require that we make a determination as to whether these guys should be detained or released. And we're not doing that. And I'll never forget, he sort of smiles and says, well, how do you know they're not being abused? And I pulled myself up. And I said, because I spent 28 years in the United States Navy, and I know military personnel, and I know leadership, and I know that we would not let that happen. And it was about a month later that those iconic pictures of Abu Ghraib came out. Because they're all terrorists, and different rules apply. They're the worst of the worst. And for those of you who haven't been in the military, you don't really understand the chain of command. But those kinds of words coming from the Vice President of the United States, although he's not actually in the chain of command, as it turns out, but be that as it may, coming from the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, who is in the chain of command, those words go down the chain of command like a rock. And so that people like Lindy England know what the people at the Pentagon, in the E-ring of the Pentagon, are thinking. Because the general tells the colonel, and the colonel tells the major, and the major tells the first sergeant, and pretty soon, they're all terrorists, they're all born killers, they're all taken off the battlefield, and different rules apply. So, what's happened? Geneva Conventions don't apply. We've got Gitmo, which was located there. We sent there a 1903 coaling station for naval ships. We sent Castro $100 a year for all those years, which he sent back because he wanted the land back. But we sent them there because that was a lawless zone. No law was going, the Supreme Court said that was wrong, but we sent them there because we didn't want law to apply. It's not the United States, it's not Cuba, no law applies. And then what do we call them? We say they're not prisoners of war because they're not wearing insignia identifiable from a distance, they're not bearing their arms openly, they're not following the law of war, and they're not in a command structure. Those 4 requirements to be a prisoner of war. So they're not a prisoner of war, so we don't have to pay them in Swiss francs. So what are they? They're unlawful enemy combatants. Unlawful. They're in a no-law zone. They're unlawful enemy combatants. You see a pattern here? Because we don't want the law to apply. You know, unlawful enemy combatant means that criminal law, U.S. criminal law, doesn't apply, right? And it also means the law of war, the law of armed conflict, doesn't apply because they're unlawful enemy combatants. Now, as it turns out, fortunately, the Supreme Court has stepped in and has resolved some of those issues. So they do have certain rights. We have taken away habeas corpus for the 4th time in our history and the first time in history, in the U.S. history, habeas corpus going back to King John and the Magna Carta. For the first time in history, we've taken away, without regard, no temporal limits and no geographic limits. We have, we've got military commissions. And I won't get into that in great depth because Stuart's going to talk about it more. At first, we're an abomination, I think. Absolute kangaroo courts. Congress stepped in the Military Commissions Act and has changed them so that they are better now, but only after the Supreme Court said that Common Article 3 of what? The Geneva Conventions applies. The Supreme Court said the Geneva Conventions apply, which is to say Common Article 3 applies. Now, Common Article 3 has kind of 2 parts to it. In sort of general terms, there's one part that says that you may only try people, combatants, in a forum which has all the rights considered to be indispensable by civilized peoples. Presumption of innocence, jury trial, confrontation, those kinds of things. All the rights considered to be indispensable by civilized people. That's the first part of Common Article 3. But then there's another part that says no torture, no cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. That's not the part that the court was talking about in the case in which they decided the original military commissions failed that test. But it did bring in no torture, no CID, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Now, we have to deal with that. And for those of you who think that it might be those issues are resolved, I'll give you 2 examples of why they're not. I testified at both the confirmation hearings for both Alberto Gonzalez to be the Attorney General and for Michael Mukasey to be the Attorney General. I was there when Mukasey said that he didn't know what waterboarding was, but what he thought it might be, he couldn't say whether it was torture or not. The United States of America has prosecuted U.S. military officers for waterboarding and sent them to prison for waterboarding because it was torture, considered to be torture, violation of it was a war crime. Another silly little example, but it's an example nonetheless. In my home state of New Hampshire, we recently had a primary, and one of the candidates was a West Point graduate, former Green Beret, and a lawyer, who said he was opposed to torture and waterboarding wasn't it. So it's still, the question is, in the minds of some people, is still out there. So let me get to how we can lose the war on terror. The enemy can't defeat us militarily. They cannot defeat us militarily. They got no lift. They got very little communications besides cell phones and stuff. You know, they can't defeat us militarily. Their only weapons are hate and terror. That's all they've got. Let's talk about what kind of war this is and what it is not. This is not an existential war. We lost 400,000 people in World War II. We lost 58,000 in Vietnam. We lost 50,000 in Korea. We lost 600 or more thousand in the Civil War. This is, I might get some objection to this, but I will say it. This is a cakewalk compared to World War II or the Cold War, where we were dealing with the Soviet Union. And this is bad, but this is not an existential war. It is also not the last war we're going to fight. Plato said that only the dead have seen their last war. This is a prelude to the peace. It's also the war before whatever the next war is. And we have to fight this war reminding ourselves and never forgetting that it's a prelude to the peace and that there's going to be another war. And as people in the military will sometimes say, we need to keep our powder dry for that peace and for that next war. The military is very, very good at what it is they do. They fight and win our nation's wars. But the only thing they can do, with respect, the only thing the military can do is buy the time and space necessary for real solutions to take place. Social, economic, cultural, religious solutions. The military is not in and of itself the solution. Never was, never will be. The military buys the time and space for the real solutions to take place. And if we start to think that the military is going to be the solution, we are going to be sadly mistaken. Now, another thing that this war is asymmetric. In asymmetric warfare, one of the goals is to match your strengths against the enemy's weakness. Our strength is not just our military, as wonderful as it is. It's not our natural resources. Sure as hell not our economy right now. It's not the island nature of our land mass. Bono had it right. Our strength is our ideas. America isn't just a country, it's an idea. It's our idea and our ideals, which works out well because the enemy's weakness is that they are absolutely bereft of ideas and ideals. All they got is hate. So we need to be very careful that we match our ideas and our ideals against their weakness, which is that they don't have any. Now, what's the enemy's goal? What's victory for the enemy? Victory for the enemy, I would submit to you, is not killing us, because they can't kill us fast enough. It's not even breaking our will to fight. The enemy's goal is to make us more like them. This is the first war in our history where the enemy didn't want the war to end. In every other war, the enemy wanted to win, but they wanted it to end. This enemy doesn't want it to end. They're perfectly happy to have it go on forever. So our mission, not the Army's mission. The Army's got a different. The nation's mission is to not forget who we are, and to, in tough times, to hold those ideas and ideals ever so much more tightly, because now is when it's really tough. You know, it's not a rule of law unless it applies all the time. It's not a human right unless it applies to everybody. If it only applies when it's convenient, if it only applies to some humans, it's not a rule of law and it's not a human right. It's something else. And we need to remember that, because that's our greatest weapon. That's what made this country great. And if we fight this war like it's the last war we're ever going to fight, and we give up everything that we have stood for 200, that overstates it. If we give up some of the things that we have stood for 200 years or more, we're disarming ourselves. The enemy can't defeat us, but we can commit national suicide by spying on each other, by abusing ourselves and others, by forgetting who it is we are. If we don't, if we stand up tall and we think we're American, this is what we stand for, and by God, we're not going to give it up, in the end, we'll win. In the end, we'll be victorious. So, with that, I will turn it over to my, I'm proud to say, my friend and colleague, Stuart Couch.
It's kind of hard coming behind a rear admiral, but I'll do the best I can.
That's what rear means.
Yes, sir. At the outset, let me, I have to make a disclaimer here, because unlike the admiral, I am not retired from active duty yet. And so my comments tonight are my personal opinions only. They do not reflect those opinions or policies of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or the United States Marine Corps. And furthermore, none of my comments should be taken as any indication how myself or another judge on the United States Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals might rule in any particular case. So, having given you all the legalese up front, I think probably it's best served if I give just a little bit of the situation I dealt with to sort of put some meat on the bones, if you will, of the Admiral's comments already. And I hope that in my situation, you can see the problem areas of a policy of cruelty and how they get borne out when we deal with them in the illegal arena, specifically in a criminal prosecution for alleged violations of the laws of armed conflict. I need to give a little bit of background. Before I became a judge advocate in the Marine Corps, I was a C-130 pilot. And one of my squadron mates at Cherry Point was a guy by the name of Michael Horrocks. 1 month before 9/11, I for whatever dumb reason, decided to become a lawyer and had gone to law school. I'd left the flying days behind me, and I'd actually gotten off of active duty. I went on for what I thought was a 5-month stint to work on a case 1 month before 9/11. And in the days right after 9/11, the Marine C-130 community is a very small community, and the word quickly went out that one of our squadron mates, Michael Horrocks, had been the co-pilot on United Flight 175, which was the second airplane to go into the World Trade Center. We actually last Friday night, or a week ago Friday night, we had a memorial up in Philadelphia with a bunch of Mike's football teammates from Westchester College, and I had a chance to see Miriam, his widow, who is since remarried. And it kind of brought all this back. It's one thing to see 9/11. It's one thing to see the anguish and the horror that we all felt as Americans that day. For me personally, it was real difficult thinking about somebody that I knew, somebody that I had shared hours on an airplane with, being murdered in cold blood with a box cutter. So that was kind of how, when 9/11 went down, that was one of the more immediate things in my mind. And shortly thereafter, the president, on November the 13th of 2001, signed a president's military order directing the use of military commissions. Now, for those of you that might not be familiar with what a military commission is, it's not a criminal prosecution under Article 3 of the Constitution, which you would find out here in a federal courthouse. It is not a prosecution at a court-martial that we would find under the Uniform Code of Military Justice under Article 1 of the Constitution, being an act of Congress. It's an animal under Article 2, derived under the President's Commander-in-Chief authority as Commander-in-Chief of the military. And it's reserved for war crimes. And we've had military commissions conducted by the United States going all the way back to General Washington in the Revolutionary War. So at any rate, the President signs this military order. We're now finding out a lot of more background information as to how that decision was made. There are several books I could commend to you if you're interested. There's a book, Jane Mayer's book, The Dark Side, which is now on the bestseller list, which I think is, from what I've seen so far, really the most authoritative book on the subject. But what we now know is that the Vice President's office and David Addington, specifically the General Counsel to the Vice President, basically took an order that FDR, President Roosevelt, had used in World War II and just rewrote it for the President to sign in November of 2001 to use as the legal basis to prosecute detainees that were going to be held at Guantanamo Bay. Well, what we've now found out, there was a disconnect between what the President signed and basically the advent of military justice from 1943 until 2001 was drastic. In that interim time, the Uniform Code of Military Justice had been enacted. More importantly, for our purposes, the Geneva Conventions had been adopted. And thirdly, the rise of customary international law as it applies to how you handle the prosecutions of the violations of the laws of armed conflict. So at any rate, with all of this going on, I get tapped as one of the 2 Marine Corps officers that are going to be assigned to the Office of Military Commissions. The other Marine was a fellow lieutenant colonel that I had known. And so in August of 2003, I checked in, thinking that this was going to be a 3-year tour, and thinking, from what I had been told, hey, look, by the time you get here, we're going to be in the middle of the first round of prosecutions, and we're going to be really busy. As it was, I left 3 years later to the day without having a single completed case. At any rate, when I got there in August of 2003, everybody was motivated to prosecute terrorists. That was what was on our mind, and it was not far out of our mind that we are a country at war, and that the individuals we were dealing with could have very well committed some heinous acts. At least that was what was indicated to us going into this. In October of 2003, I made my first trip to Guantanamo. And this was just to go down there and see the lay of the land and, okay, this is how it's laid out. These are where the detainees are kept. And part of that is any prosecutor, and it's not just military prosecutor, any prosecutor will tell you it's important to know what's going on with the defendant in a particular case. You got to know, how are they being detained? How are they being questioned? If they've made confessions or incriminating statements, how those statements were taken. Okay, because the jury is going to weigh that thing out. Jury does not trust anybody, especially in the world now we find ourselves of CSI and Judge Judy and all that good stuff. I mean, that comes into play in a courtroom a civilian courtroom or a military courtroom every day. It's a credibility contest. So, the more experienced and the more nuanced prosecutors are going to want to know everything that goes on with a particular defendant, including how they're housed and how they're questioned. So I went to Guantanamo in October of 2003, and I was getting ready to watch an interview through a two-way mirror of a detainee that I had an active case on. This gent, Al-Qaeda, I later met the guy, and as far as an Al-Qaeda terrorist goes, he's a fairly pleasant individual. but at any rate, he's a very cooperative detainee, and they were going to interview him, and this was going to be my opportunity to watch him through the two-way mirror and sort of size him up, see what this guy's made out of. Well, as I was waiting for the interview to get started, I heard this rock and roll music blaring down the hallway. And my first thought, I've prosecuted my fair share of enlisted Marines before. I'm thinking, some guys are down there listening to some rock music and got a little carried away. So I immediately stepped out of the booth I was in and went down the hallway to get them to turn it off. And as I turned the corner of the room where the music was coming out of, I looked in there, and there were no overhead lights, but there was a strobe light going at the end of the room, and there was this heavy metal, Metallica, rock and roll music blaring out louder than anything I'd ever heard in college. And in the back corner of the room, I see a detainee in an orange jumpsuit, shackled to the floor, hands to his feet and to the floor, and he's rocking back and forth and he's praying. Now, at that moment, I had a flashback. And the flashback went back to when I was a pilot, because in the Marine Corps, the majority of our aviators go to what we call SEER school. And SEER stands for Search, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. It's basically it's a crash course on how to be a POW. They don't feed you for about 4.5 days. They put you out in the woods and you run around for about 3 days, and then you get caught and you get put in a prisoner of war camp. And to my knowledge, and each one of the services has got this SEER school. To my knowledge, it's the only school in the military where the instructors are authorized to assault you, to beat you. To my knowledge, it's the only place we can do it legally. I'm not going to go into everything that went on with me there, but I will tell you this. When I saw what was happening there, I immediately knew these guys are playing out of a SEER school playbook. And I was infuriated by it. And then after more reflection, frankly, I was disgusted, and ultimately I was saddened, because in my view, in our effort to get information out of these detainees, we had compromised what it's all about to be an American. We had torn at the fabric of what we're all about. And really, when you get down to it, what are Americans about? We're about fair play and justice. We're about the recognition of the inherent dignity of every human being. That's in our Declaration of Independence. Our entire jurisprudence is a reflection of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And this type of behavior was tearing at that. Now, I'm not the brightest bulb in the socket. I was not the smartest prosecutor in the office, but I was the only guy who'd been to SEER school because I'd been an aviator. I hadn't been a straight lawyer. So I go back to the office and I said, folks, we got a problem here. Because what I saw down there was out of the SEER school playbook. And if they're using the SEER school playbook to interrogate detainees, we have to assume that the information they're getting out of them is coerced, and either we're not going to be able to get it into evidence against them, the individual detainee, or if it's information that detainee has given up about another detainee, we're not going to be able to get it in against them. Now, the counter to that is, but the rules allow, look, you don't need to get into that. If it's on a document and it's in the possession of the United States government, who cares how they got it? It comes into evidence. And at that time, the rules would have seemingly allowed that. Okay? And again, these rules were written by people that are not litigators, that know about the only thing they know about military justice is there's a thing called the UCMJ, but they sure as heck hadn't read it. But what we were trying to, what myself and other experienced prosecutors in the office were trying to say is, look, when this thing gets in the hands of a military jury, when this thing gets in front of a military judge, it is not going to be a cakewalk. I got news for you. If I was a civilian guy and I committed some crime, I would much rather be prosecuted in a court-martial in front of a military jury, in front of a military judge, than I would to be prosecuted in a civilian court. And I've done both. I've been a state prosecutor in the state of North Carolina. I've been a federal prosecutor in North Carolina. And I've been a military prosecutor. And I got to tell you, as a military prosecutor, it's a lot more difficult to get a conviction. There are a lot more protections, both under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and just a reflection of our tradition of fair play and justice. Well, as a backdrop with this, I get on my desk one of the more serious detainee cases in Guantanamo. This guy's name's Mohammed Aoud Slahi. His uncle happens to be was like the religious leader on, if you can call it, Osama bin Laden's staff. Al-Qaeda, circa 2000, circa September 2001, he has a staff called the Shura Council. And each one of the folks on the Shura Council represent a different office, so to speak. You got a guy that's responsible for operations, a guy responsible for logistics. Well, they have their own chaplain, so to speak. So he's like the chaplain of Al-Qaeda. And this is Slahi's uncle. So right there, he's got some connections. And I remember when the case was turned over, when the case was given to me, when I showed up, they said, look, this guy might be the most serious guy we have now at Guantanamo. And mind you, in 2003, the big fish, that I like to call them, the folks responsible for 9/11, had not found their way to Guantanamo yet. I was told this case might be the most significant we've got at Guantanamo, but he's on special projects. I said, well, what do you mean special projects? He said, well, I don't really know. The guy was telling me, I really don't know what special projects are, but it's a special way that they're interrogating down there, and it might not be very good because they won't tell us what's going on. We have no play in that. The other thing about Slahi was a guy by the name of Ramzi bin al-Sheikh, who was the right-hand man for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the head mastermind for 9/11. Ramzi bin al-Sheikh said Slahi had helped him and two other hijackers from 9/11 go to training in Afghanistan. So I'm thinking, okay, he's one of the few detainees I've seen so far that's got a 9/11 connection or legend. Well, and I've got to nuance my comments here, but I went to particular agencies that might know more information about Ramzi bin al-Sheikh to say, okay, how do we know that Ramzi bin al-Sheikh said this? Where is he from? Well, we can't tell you that. We will neither confirm nor deny that he is in custody anywhere. And I said, well, look, I got a top secret SCI clearance. It's the highest clearance you can get. I got to need to know. I'm prosecuting this chump that Ramzi says he knows. Well, sorry, I can't tell you. Okay? Well, I'm looking at Slahi. Slahi's really not saying much in August of 2003. But I've been told that he's on special projects. Around about the time of fall of 2003, in October, November time frame, all of a sudden, overnight, Slahi starts pushing out information. He is the shell answer man. I mean, literally overnight. They're putting out about 3 or 4 intelligence reports every day on this guy. And it's stuff about the Al-Qaeda organization in Germany and other parts of Europe, just reams and reams of information. And I'm asking, okay, can somebody please tell me why he's saying these things? Can't tell you that. Well, I had a criminal investigator. He's an investigator for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Himself, he was a former Marine. I can't tell you his name because of his current duty assignment right now, but this guy's a great American. And I'll call him Scott. And Scott and I were on the same wavelength. And I said, Scott, look, nobody would love to stick a needle in this guy's arm more than me, okay? But we got to do it. We got to do it right, and we got to do it in such a way that evidence is going to be persuasive to a military jury. And Scott says, "Yep, you're right." And he's digging as much information as he could. Now there was this wall at Guantanamo between the information the criminal investigators were getting, that is, the criminal investigators that were working for us, the FBI, and so forth, And on the other side of that wall was the intelligence information that was being derived from these detainees. And there's this wall between the two, and the two things were not supposed to mix. But somehow, Scott had friends on the other side of the wall. And over the next 9 months, Scott would give me occasionally information from the other side of that wall. And so now Slahi states, and I'm not saying anything that's not already out on the internet, that in fact it was all testified to in front of Congress. Slahi's case came out in front of Congress on the record in 2005. Slahi was in the hands of another agency, and shortly thereafter it was in the hands of another country for a period of months before he made his way to Guantanamo. So he had all kinds of allegations and nasty stuff that had happened to him when he was somewhere else. For the time being, I knew that Al-Qaeda had trained its operatives to claim torture if they were ever taken in the hands of a foreign government. So I said, okay, I'm going to set aside everything that Slahi claims happened to him. I'm going to assume that he's lying to us about that. What I started seeing under the table in United States government documents that Scott provided me from the intelligence side ultimately indicated to me that he had been tortured. And this is not just Stuart Couch's idea of what torture is. This flunks the definition of the UN Convention Against Torture or Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment. And the excerpt's on the backside of that yellow piece of paper that everybody got handed when you came in here. There are definitions there. And from the United States government documents, what people wrote down and had in the files, I found that they made a prima facie case that he'd been tortured. And specifically, I'm talking about mental suffering. There was an occasion where this guy was taken out and led to believe he was going to be executed to the point where he urinated on himself. That flunks the definition. You can't do that. And by the way, this UN Torture Convention, it's been adopted as domestic law under our War Crimes Act. So the United States, and look, before I got military commissions, I didn't know jack about international law. I knew how to spell it. That was about it. But what I know now is you got a treaty, and so we got together with all these other countries and said, okay, we're not going to torture people, and here's the definitions, and here's our obligations. Everybody good with that? Yeah, everybody's good with that. All right, we signed a treaty. Part of that treaty requirement is that you go back to your country, and it's now got to be adopted as domestic law. So what we did is we went back with it. We adopted it as domestic law. Congress ratified it, and now it was considered a violation of the War Crimes Act. Now, we took a reservation, and this is some of that more nuanced international law stuff that I'm not real tight on, but we had a reservation as to what constituted cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in a moment. But at any rate, we agreed to the definition of torture, and we agreed to the prohibition of torture, and we have that, and we can penalize people that commit torture under the War Crimes Act. So, by the spring of 2004, I became convinced of what I had seen, that this guy had been tortured. They'd taken him out, made him believe he was going to be executed. Basically, I would say more than insinuated to him that he was going to be executed. And here was the final straw. And by the way, there was a piece of classified information that I was given. And all I can tell you about it was clear to me that they had purposely set him up for mental suffering. And as Forrest Gump said, that's all I'm going to say about that. But again, that flunks part of the UN Torture Convention. Finally, final straw for me was I had seen it in some intelligence reports, and then I actually saw a document. They went in with an interrogator who was wearing the uniform of a Navy captain. In actuality, it was a Navy lieutenant. And he had Slahi believing that he was from the White House. And he said, I've got this piece of paper here, and it's from the United States State Department, and you need to read this. And Slahi speaks 5 languages, including English. So he can read this thing. He's a smart little guy. In the document, it says basically, it's ostensibly from the State Department to the Department of Defense. And saying, hey, Slahi's mother and his brother have been detained by the United States government, being held by another agency. His mom is going to get brought to Guantanamo, and we have concerns because she's going to be the only female at Guantanamo. We have concerns about her safety with all those other men around. And when this was presented to Slahi, it was also presented that, yeah, your mom's going to get gang raped. If you take a look at that definition on the back side of that yellow piece of paper, it flunks that too. So at that point, I've got a personal crisis, frankly. I got in my mind, legally, I believe that we had violated the UN Torture Convention. I felt that ethically, I would have a responsibility when and if Slahi got a defense attorney, that I would have to provide that defense attorney with what I knew so that they could bring a challenge under Article 15 of the UN Torture Convention. Article 15 of the UN Torture Convention says this: if you've got evidence that was derived as a result of torture, it's not admissible in any proceeding. Any proceeding. That means Article 3 courts, Article 1 courts, and Article 2 courts. So I felt like legally we had violated the Torture Convention. Ethically, I had a duty to disclose that to his defense attorney whenever he got a defense attorney. And I had a moral issue. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and use this as a bully pulpit, but the bottom line is I'm a Christian. And, you know, in that Christian belief, fundamental to that is that we are all created as human beings with human dignity, God-given human dignity. My belief is that we were created in the image of God, and for that reason, that's why we've got the religious dictates in the Christian faith as to human dignity. And as I said before, that's a part of the Judeo-Christian ethic that is a thread that runs throughout American jurisprudence. So I'm at church on Sunday. I go to a church that's got like 1,500 people, the Falls Church in Virginia. It's got like 1,500 people every Sunday. I mean, it's just, everybody's packed in here. And this particular Sunday, we had a baptism that was going on. And in the Anglican faith, you go through the baptism, they baptize the baby, and then everybody stands up, and there's a series of questions that the pastor asks the congregation. And the congregation repeats them back. And it's basically the tenets of the faith. And the last one says, I will seek justice on the earth and respect the dignity of every human being. And on that particular Sunday, I could have been the only dude in that room. I felt real little. And what I felt like God's point to me on that one, I'm not one of these guys that says, hey, you know, I'm like Moses. I go around there and I see burning bushes and all this stuff. But what I felt like God was putting on me that day was this. Are you going to come in here on Sunday and profess to believe this, and then you go out of here and you go through the other 6 days a week and just blow it off? Or do you really believe that? And at that moment, I felt convicted. And I was sitting on the fence over this weekend as to what I was going to do about this Slahi case. And after the next 2 more days of thinking and praying about it, I said, you know, hey, here it is. And I went in to my boss and I said, hey, this is it. I think, you know, here's the legal, the ethical, the moral, and for the moral reason alone, I refuse to have any further prosecution in this case, any further participation in the case. What I had hoped that act would do was that my boss, he might just say, all right, shut up, Couch, get out of my office. But my hope was that he would go back over to the Pentagon, to the DOD General Counsel's office, and say, Houston, we have a problem. And at least alert somebody that there was a problem in the hopes of they would stop this policy, and then would realize there are going to be impediments to our prosecution of these cases at military commissions. But I was wrong. To my knowledge, that issue never went up. But later on, the case of Slahi was investigated. It was investigated by people that never even asked to interview me. They never even knew that I refused to prosecute his case. And yet they came up with many of the same conclusions that I had, and they shared them with Congress. If you're curious to take a look at that, it's called the Schmidt-Furlow investigation. So, where does all this lead us? It all comes back to this. Let me sum up. Number one, the torture or cruel or inhumane or degrading treatment of any other human being is wrong. And my personal opinion is that as a country, if we adopt a policy of cruelty, it's going to spell nothing but trouble, because it tears at the very fabric of what we are as Americans. You know, this is a nonpartisan issue if there ever was one. This is not something the Republicans or the Democrats should try to lay claim to. We all of us as Americans ought to lay claim to this. John McCain, in the floor debate on the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005, I believe he had it right. And he says, this is not about them, this is about us. I think he's exactly right. We are going to win this war against these bunch of chumps, not because, we're going to win this against them because we're better than they are, not because we are more inhumane. And I will tell you this, they got a lot of inhumanity going on. Now, sometimes you hear about this thing about the reciprocal idea, that is, we ought to treat them humanely so that other forces that detain our service members are going to reciprocate. When you're dealing with Al-Qaeda, that's a bunch of crap. If I'm ever captured by Al-Qaeda, they're going to cut my head off and hang it up there just like it did Nick Berg. Okay? Now, does that fact give us the right to just jettison our own morals? To just dispense as quaint our own respect for the treatment of detainees, whoever they are? I don't think it does. The second point I want to leave you with, and this one's clear. You get evidence from coerced interrogations, it is worthless in a courtroom. And these first iterations, and I was the lead prosecutor on Hamdan, so I know the Hamdan case real well. But for the Supreme Court's ruling, I'd probably had to stick there another 2 years to prosecute that chunk. But I can tell you this, the evidence that is obtained from coercion, and we didn't have any of that in Hamdan's case, that evidence is useless in a courtroom. McCain tells another story. One time he got hung up for like 2 days by parachute cords, and they were beating the fool out of him, trying to get his chain of command out of him. And after 2 days, with his arms pulled out of their sockets, what do you think he finally told them his chain of command was? He gave them a list of names. The names he gave them was the starting offensive line for the Green Bay Packers. You'll tell them anything you want to make the pain stop. But that doesn't mean it's worth anything as evidence. Finally, it's bad strategy. We are in a war of ideas, and this is exactly what Admiral Hutson was talking about. And after 3 years of studying these knuckleheads, I think I got basically a master's degree in Al-Qaeda, okay? They could care less about our natural resources. They could care less with coming over here and annexing New York City to live there. None of that. What these guys care about is a war of ideas. And unfortunately, when we've got situations like Abu Ghraib and the abuses at Guantanamo and things like that, we are proving bin Laden's point in their minds, in their eyes. Because it is a very uninformed, narrow view of Islam. And they are extremists. And I can tell you, I've traveled in the Middle East, I've been to Pakistan, I've worked with a lot of those folks over there on these cases. They're absolutely furious with what bin Laden and his crowd in Al-Qaeda have done to the Muslim image worldwide. They are furious. They didn't have to worry about the United States having anything to do with them until 9/11 went down. So this is a war of ideas, and I think a policy of cruelty, like set the things in action like that occurred at Abu Ghraib and occurred at Guantanamo, that does not fit into our strategic plan of what we're going to need to win this global war on terrorism. So at any rate, I'm very thankful to the National Security Network for setting up this evening. Very thankful for you all having us down here. And at this time, I'd like to open it to any questions that you might have.
Hi. On. Okay. Hi, I'm Daisy Ross. I'm a freshman. I was just wondering, with the Slocky case, was any of his intelligence effectively used? I mean, obviously, that's not the main issue, but I think that would be the arguing point of, if we do gain intelligence by means, that's the argument for torture, if it's valuable, would that be more of proof why it should continue?
Okay, so in other words, just to make sure I got your question right, it would be, there's a means. Do the means justify the ends when we're talking about the intelligence piece? Okay, all right. I'll field this grand ball. Far and away, and I saw a lot of the information that came out, at least on the Guantanamo detainees that we had. I was also privy to some of the detainees that were held in other locations by other agencies. But far and away, from just the Guantanamo evidence that I saw, the most valuable stuff were the FBI 302s. A 302 is a form where they record what an individual tells them. And we had this one agent in particular, and I can speak his name because he's all over the books now, Ali Soufan. Ali Soufan is of Lebanese descent, was one of 4 FBI agents that was a fluent Arab speaker on 9/11. In fact, he was already downrange working on the coal investigation in Yemen on 9/11. Ali got a whole different way of dealing with these guys. Instead of going in there and, playing Joe Friday, with them or intimidating them, he sits down, he has tea, he goes through the prayers with them, and he'll like Hamdan. He laid down and slept next to Hamdan for like 3 days. Spends all his time with them, and he's got this huge background of knowledge of the organization that's been developed over time, and he establishes rapport. And it's that rapport-based information that is the most valuable. That's the most critical stuff. And there was a huge rift in the early days between the agency and between the FBI with this information that the FBI was managing to get out of these detainees. Now, I'm not an intelligence officer. And as a result of that, I was never able to see what they were doing with this information from an intelligence perspective and what goes on. But I can tell you this, though, that intelligence information, you collect all kinds of bits of information and then you make assumptions on that information. If any bit of that information is wrong, then it affects and damages your assumptions. And then decisions are based upon assumptions in that respect. So ultimately you can get some bad decisions. So I would submit to you that if you've got a policy of cruelty, and I've had the screws put to me in SEER school before, you'll tell them anything to get it to stop. So if you have a situation where they're given false information and assumptions are going to be made upon false information, in part you're going to get false assumptions, and that leads to bad decisions. So that's the best argument I can give. It doesn't work in practice.
Let me add to that, too, not maybe perhaps in direct response to your question, but motivated by your question. The experiences in World War II, that 85 to 95% of the people that we captured gave us what they knew by simply asking them questions. In Vietnam, it was about 95%. It was at the high end of that. The people that we're fighting now are not Superman. They're not tougher than the Nazis or the Japanese. So there's no particular reason, and most of them are chumps and knuckleheads. The people that we've, not KSM and some others, but most of them are chumps and knuckleheads. I mean, Hamdan was Bin Laden's driver. It's like Hitler's driver. Wasn't Hitler, wasn't Goering, wasn't Himmler. It was his driver. So there's no particular reason to believe that they're going to be tougher than people that we have faced before. And if you put aside, we can talk about torture as a technique. And if you put aside the moral question or the diplomatic question or the question of what it does to our fabric as a society, General Charles Clarke, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, makes a big point about how when we military take young men and women into the military from their homes, from their parents and their spouses, we have a moral obligation to turn them back, if we can turn them back at all, to turn them back better than they were when we got them. And if they come back as torturers, we have failed in that. So we've got an obligation there. But put all those questions aside. The real question isn't besides those questions, which are real. But the other real question is not whether torture works or not. That's a false dichotomy. It probably does work sometimes. You put a low torch to their genitals, and they're going to tell you something, and it may actually be the truth. Well, you don't know that, but it may be. So the real question isn't whether or not it works. The real question is whether there are tactics that work better. And as Stuart just said, there are. And if you go back to World War II, and there are there are a number of World War II interrogators and still alive, still talking, and follow up to and including the War on Terror. Most of them will tell you that it's rapport that really gets the information. Torture is the technique of the lazy, the stupid, and the pseudo-tough. And it always, always, always drifts into sadism. Always. It always drifts into sadism. There are lots of psychological examples, the Stanford experiment, where it drifts into sadism. Sometimes that's intentional, because military people, being who they are, if a little torture is good, then more is better. And the other point is, if a little torture is good, if waterboarding is good, because it may get you information, then why not the rack? Why not drawing and quartering? If it's good, then you've got a moral obligation to do it all. And then you're into hostage-taking, treachery, perfidy. Now you've completely lost it. You have taken that step down the slippery slope that will never end. And so don't think of it in terms of whether or not torture works. Think of it in terms of whether or not there are better techniques than that.
Let me give two quick examples of what I believe Admiral Hutson was just talking about. One, the most successful German interrogator of World War II. Can't remember the guy's name, but apparently he had lived for about 10 years in Chicago. Spoke fluent English, knew a lot about what? Baseball. He's the most successful German interrogator of the American air crews in the Luftwaffe Stalags in Germany, because they would come in, he would sit down, and the first 3 or 4 sessions, he gives them cigarettes and a cup of coffee and starts talking about baseball and Chicago and pizza and that kind of stuff. And he establishes rapport with them. Before too long, they were giving up all kinds of information to this guy. It's out there. I'm not making it up. You type it on the internet to see it. There's a quick vignette. You remember I told you the guy that I was going to watch through the two-way mirror? That guy had also been in the hands of another agency and turned up in Afghanistan. And the military interrogators in 2002 worked him over pretty good. And there's a whole other story to that I'm not going to get into. But at any rate, about 6 weeks into his deal, the FBI had caught wind of who this guy was and how he had been detained. So the FBI sends these 2 young FBI agents out there. And this guy, and I'm not going to mention the detainee's name because his case is out there. He knows him as Tom and Jerry. You know Tom and Jerry cartoon? I'm probably dating myself. The cat and the mouse. At any rate, he knows these 2 guys as Tom and Jerry.
I know what you're talking about.
Thanks. All right, so Tom and Jerry are in there, and they're in the room with this guy. And it's like the second session they've had with him, and there's a window in the room. Window to the outside, it's glass or whatever. And there was a mortar attack and an explosion outside, and the glass burst in. And as soon as that blast went off and the glass came in, the first thing that Tom and Jerry did was what? They threw their bodies over top of the detainee to protect him from the explosion. And about the time that everything settled down and the dust settled and this detainee came out from under that, he's like, boom. It's like, where are these infidels that Osama bin Laden's been telling us about? What do you think the turning point was when Tom and Jerry started getting some really righteous information out of this guy? And I'd like to go into the information he gave Tom and Jerry, because I believe it's probably one of the best cases down in Guantanamo, but I don't feel at liberty to do that. I don't want to wind up on a witness list for some doggone prosecutor or defense attorney down there. But I can tell you, this guy was involved in some real serious operations, and a bulk of the information that he gave up about that was given to Tom and Jerry, the FBI agents that were willing to protect him from an explosion coming through the window.
Now, what can I do for you? You're in a tough spot. How are we going to get this? What's your end game strategy? What can you give me so I can help you? What about your wife, your kids?
Tom didn't want a phone call home. That's what he got.
Can I let you call home? Let them know you're okay. But you got to help me. You got to work with me on this.
System worked, though, didn't it?
Which?
The judicial system. The Supreme Court put to rest these crazy tribunals, or almost has. And there's a young man who's running the international relations for Walmart who will be an American hero forever.
Alberto Moro.
And
Although he's left Walmart now.
I'll sell my stock.
You might have done that anyway.
But the system worked. And that's something we can never, ever forget. We had a bump in the road from my point of view, Stuart's point of view, and the point of view of other people. We lost our way for a while, but it worked. And it was people like Stuart, people like Alberto Moro, who was the one that took this problem to Jim Haynes, the DOD General Counsel, because he'd been told by one of the Navy investigators about what was going on, and the court system. The Congress didn't shroud itself in glory during the course of this. I would suggest that a lot of people in the administration didn't shroud themselves in glory. But in the end, the system worked.
Is there any reason in the world why we are trying these people? We're not going to execute anybody. You know that. I know that. The other people do. Why don't we just hold them?
I don't think we can do that either.
You don't?
No, I think of all the detainees at Guantanamo. There's a lot of them that are detained because they're enemy combatants, and frankly, if the Geneva Conventions and international customary international law says you can hold them to the end of hostilities. So guess what? If you're dumb enough to belong to an organization that says this is going to be a war until we're all dead, okay. Well, and you get to be held until the end of hostilities. Too bad. You're not ever going to get let out. I really don't have I don't have sympathy for that crowd. But there is a subset of what I call the big fish. Okay, and these are the folks that are responsible for the attack on the USS Cole, the attack on the East Africa embassies, and 9/11. And in my opinion, they need to get the full measure of the law, even if it includes an execution. But if we do that, it's got to be done with justice and fairness. And what is that? And that's one of the problems with the law. The law always gropes in a dark room around this to figure out what is just, what is fair. I think we're getting there. And we're getting there as a reaction in the court system, through our federal courts and these habeas petitions. We're getting there as a result of the Supreme Court ruling in Hamdan. The Supreme Court ruling in Boumediene. These things are formulating what's going to be just. But you still got that thing about what is fair. And you got to see that play out. But I would submit to you, I know a lot of the individuals that are involved in these prosecutions, that are involved on the judicial side of it. We've got some very talented, very committed, and very fair individuals that are working these cases. And I believe they're going to be borne out. I'll tell you this, they're going to get a lot more appellate, the chance to challenge their convictions and sentences on appeal today than they would have under the first iteration of these things.
One of the problems, though, that in your question certainly implies it, is that the people that we've prosecuted thus far, Hamdan is a driver, Hicks the big winner in this whole thing is the one guy that we have prosecuted who pled guilty, Hicks, who interestingly was an Australian, was literally a kangaroo skinner in a meatpacking factory. I mean, he was just a born loser. And, he got 9 months and was sent home. So that, typically, military commissions, as Stuart said earlier, first one appears to have been Major Andre, who was Benedict Arnold's counterpart. Went on, we've done them over the years, but they are not, it's hard sometimes to prosecute the little guys because the evidence is more difficult. KSM, and we may have other problems with KSM, but going back to your point, but at least we have some sense of what it is he did. Now, whether it's admissible evidence or not remains to be seen. We may have screwed the case up, but we have some sense of what we think he did. Others? Sir.
I'm Robert Marriott, Sr. My question is this. You talked about how one of the endeavors of Al-Qaeda is to compromise the beliefs and ideals which make us who we are. And it seems like in these cases, we have come dangerously close to that in several respects. Are there any policy or legal mechanisms we could employ in the future that would make us less likely to come this close to the edge?
That's a great question. How do we avoid this? What lesson have we learned? Have we learned anything? One of the, I've been a lawyer now for, I guess, over 35 years. And one of the things I've learned during that period of time recently is that lawyers are more important than I thought they were. And, I used to think it was just the law. But, clever lawyers, too clever by half, can make, black seem white, wrong seem right, torture seem okay. The Geneva Conventions don't apply. And so we were talking earlier about how we need to imbue, and it's not just lawyers. I mean, there's lots of people that are involved with this. I don't mean to just pick on the lawyers. But I think we need to imbue lawyers from the very beginning, including at law school, a sense of how good lawyers know the law and great lawyers know about life. And law isn't applied in a vacuum. It's applied in real life. I think we have learned lessons from this. And the fact that we're all sitting here talking about this, I think, is important. But I'll read to you for a moment from the Armed Forces Manual 3452, which existed, or the Army Field Manual, 3462, which existed when all this was going on. It says the use of force, mental torture, threats, insults, or exposure to unpleasant and inhumane treatment of any kind is prohibited by law. Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 93, says cruelty and maltreatment. Any person subject to this code who is guilty of cruelty toward or oppression or maltreatment of any person subject to his orders, detainees, shall be punished as the court-martial may direct. The Armed Forces officer, and this has been military doctrine for decades and decades. The United States abides by the law of war. Its armed forces, in their dealing with all other peoples, are expected to comply with the law of war in the spirit and to the letter. Wanton killing, torture, cruelty, or the working of unusual and unnecessary hardships on enemy prisoners or populations is not justified under any circumstances. So that is law and doctrine that existed when all this happened. So just passing laws isn't enough. We've got laws. We had laws in place at the time. We never had to worry about this before. So there's got, and this is a non-answer to your question, but there's there's got to be more than just enacting laws. We need to ensure that in our educational system, nobody's mother thought this was okay. I'm sure Lindy England's mother didn't think, oh, wow, Lindy, how good to see you on TV. Somewhere we failed. And I think, and I'd be interested in thoughts, we failed in accountability. Because I was talking about the chain of command and how the orders and thoughts at the top of the chain of command drop like a rock down the chain of command. The quid pro quo for that is accountability up the chain of command. Because you cannot have obedience down the chain of command unless those people at the bottom, the rock bottom, have faith that there will be accountability up the chain of command. And I think that when we say there are just a few bad apples, and they were bad apples at Abu Ghraib, there's no question about it. They were really bad apples, and they should have been and were prosecuted. But when you say it's just a few bad apples, and you don't look up the chain of command any more seriously than we did, Janice Karpinski got a letter, I guess, or something. She was the commander.
Warren didn't get promoted.
Pardon me?
Warren didn't get
That right. But that accountability up the chain of command, I think, is absolutely critical. And if Rumsfeld had said early on, in the immediate aftermath of Abu Ghraib, that I don't care if they're terrorists or if they're evildoers, they're human beings, and we're Americans, and we will treat them with the dignity and respect, to Stuart's point, that Americans should be treating all human beings by reason of their humanity. And, oh, by the way, the first general in the chain of command, where this happens again, is going to be immediately retired and court-martialed if appropriate. If he sent that message rather than there are just a few bad apples, it would have stopped. And it didn't stop. It went on and on.
Let me give you, if I just give a less sophisticated answer to that. All right. Newsflash, I'm from the South. All right. And anybody from the South will tell you when you got mold, what do you do with it? You clean it up with Clorox and you get some sunlight on it. Okay? And with all of these policies and the sequela that we've had from those policies, there's been a lot of Clorox and there's been a lot of sunlight put on that. In congressional testimony, by the public, through the media, and in some respects by people voting their conscience. So I would tell you, just from my political science days, I would say one thing to consider is that future administrations are going to see this as an untenable position if they ever try to go, the dog returns to its vomit kind of thing. If they ever try to go back and run this policy again, it's politically untenable. Now,
where's this stuff coming from?
No, actually, that's from the Old Testament. All right. All right. Yeah. So I would say that the second point would be this. At least I can tell you from the legal community, there's a lot of introspection that's going on as to who were these legal advisors advising the administration on this. And you can see with the hindsight of with the benefit of hindsight, 2020 vision, you're looking at this, you can see where the lawyers were trying to say, well, what we can do and what we can't do. And I think the more appropriate aspect ought to be what should we do or what should we not do. And guess what, lawyers? We got any lawyers out there? You're allowed to do that. You are allowed to give advice from that perspective that goes beyond what the law tells you can and you can't do. And it can include policy considerations such as economic, social, religious. You can get into those things. So I think from those two perspectives, one, we've had a lot of Clorox and sunlight on this issue. And secondly, at least in the legal community, there is a consideration of it's not just enough to say what you can do or what you can't do. We also got to consider those policy decisions.
Sir. You got a microphone here.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
I'd just like to make a comment on the previous question. It's a question that appears frequently in the press, not just with regard to this, but with regard to governmental malfunction in general. But in this particular case, my observation would be that I think the question is well-founded, but there's an underlying assumption too often that one finds that there are institutional fixes to moral issues. And the bottom line is, in my personal humble opinion, the way you fix this problem is that each person assumes the kind of responsibility you assumed, which is frankly damn hard to do, because these issues don't come marching up with brass bands playing and neon lights flashing. They usually arise slowly, creep up on you, and then one day you realize, Houston, we got a problem. And that's where inculcating at every level of society a sense of personal responsibility in a moral sense, I think is how you fix this. You don't fix it by reorganizing government or passing 12 more laws that are going to get broken by people who intend to break them anyway. That's my own personal.
I'd like to address that, and I'm speaking specifically to the students, because this is a point that I've given 12 speeches over the last year and a half to law schools all over the East Coast, and actually they flew me out to the University of California, Berkeley. Go figure it out. But the point being here, and I'm speaking to the students, okay? In the military, you talk to anybody in the military will tell you that being able to read and navigate by a map is essential to get done what you got to get done. Okay, and any kind of navigation comes in three parts. You've got a map, you've got the terrain out in front of you, and you've got a compass. And so basically what you do is you take that map, you take the compass, you orient the compass to north, and then and only then do you look out in front of you and you can figure out how to get across that terrain. Let me submit to you this. First off, that map is your education. It is an external bit of information given to you. Somebody else has already figured out what the mountains are. They've put all kinds of squiggly lines on a piece of paper. But they've figured all that out, and it's given to you. It's imparted to you for you to use it and do something with it. And that's about the same thing as this education that you're getting here in college. You're receiving it from somebody else, but what you do with it is largely up to you, how you employ it. The terrain is basically reality, or life, or in an attorney's perspective, it's a particular case or legal problem. That's the part that you got to get over or get around or figure out, okay? Now, what's the compass? I would submit to you that the compass is your moral compass. And that basically, if you're trying to navigate a map through any kind of problem, issue, life, whatever, and you're not using the compass, you're going to get lost. Now, for me, the moral compass is tied up in my Christian faith. That's what's working for me. And I'm not saying that everybody's got to have it that way, but I am telling you this. There is a necessity for a moral compass, and it takes work. You don't go down to Walmart or REI or somewhere like that and buy it off the shelf. You have to develop it. And you develop it by being well-read. You develop it by establishing relationships with others. You establish it, in some respects through your own faith. But it's up to you how you get that moral compass. But I would submit to you that you're not going to be able to handle any of these issues. And all of you might not be dealing with issues like Guantanamo Bay, but you've got a lot of other issues in all kinds of different walks of life and in professions that you're going to need to have that. And if you don't have a moral compass, you will be lost.
Good place to stand.
Once again, on behalf of Dickinson College and the Clarke Forum, I would like to thank the speakers. I'd also like to remind you of the informal discussion taking place in Stern 102. This concludes tonight's program. Thank you for coming and have a good evening.